Alright everyone, welcome back to the Fun Corporation. In this episode, we're going to go over the 1973 season for both the Fun Corporation parks of Funland and Joyland, and we're just going to hop straight into it. If you watched the previous episode, you would have seen the teaser for the new ride for Funland here in 1973, and we're actually going to add a Schwarzkopf Wildcat coaster. These coasters were fairly common in the 70s, early 70s, kind of going into the 80s. They were fairly common to see pop up at multiple different parks. They were a cheap, small addition that a lot of parks could add and say, hey, here's another ride for a lot of people to get on. So we're going to go ahead and throw one over at Funland right at the front gate just to the right. Gives guests a nice view of the front as they walk in, and it greets riders quite nicely. Let's go ahead and hop right into the construction process of Funland's Wildcat. Alright, so we're nearing the tail end of our March season here. I'm going to jump in and do a little bit of a live commentary with the opening of the first coaster that we have added to one of our parks here at Funland. We have a Schwarzkopf Wildcat 65-meter model. This is just a custom build I ended up doing in one of my design worlds, and I decided it would actually fit pretty well here, so right here. And I just plopped it in and added our transfer track. So I think throughout the month of March, I did a lot of testing on it, and I think I ran it for about an hour straight, just because, you know, in real life, you don't open a coaster without testing it a lot. But I think we are finally ready to get this guy open. So I'm going to do, because I know this is going to be an insanely popular ride when it's ready, I'm going to go ahead and pause. And I know for in-game building, this is not ideal, but I do add a crap ton of overflow to all my coasters, just because if people want to queue for them, I'm going to let them queue for the ride. So, because, I mean, in real life, you really don't want your guest queue to spill out into the pathway, especially one like this, where it's kind of cramped. So I just ended up adding a ton of overflow to make it fit, but we'll go ahead, and I'm going to go ahead and close down the transfer track to get rid of all those. Do not test it, because that will explode. And we are ready to roll. And Wildcat, soft opening just before the month of April 1973, the first added coaster to the Fun Corporation series. Alright, and with Wildcat being the only major addition to either of the parks here for Fun Corporation in the 1973 season, we're going to go ahead and go over our Joyland finances. I'm going to kind of start breaking these down into individual park breakdowns, and then we'll go to the total for the company as a total. I guess I already said that, but you know, we're going to go with it. Joyland looking pretty standard. We only paid the full-time staff wages, so we're still at that $82,400 off the board in the early months and at the end of the season. Very profitable park overall for Joyland. I mean, we ended up bringing in over $1.5 million in revenue from just this park, and that is with subtracting out the $500,000 starting cash. That's what the profit number is at the end there. And as you can see, also I started tracking how much staff we have, so I can kind of keep track of it per season, because previously I was not keeping track of that, so it was just a different number of handymen and mechanics every year. Well, not mechanics, but handymen every year was always slightly different, so I decided I'd start keeping track of that to kind of give myself a budget in mind to what I give out. But overall, very profitable park. In fact, more profitable than Funland overall with the short season it runs. We only really run the park during the peak season, so we don't have to wait out the crowds during the off season. But overall, Joyland had a very successful season, even though we didn't really add anything to it this year whatsoever. As far as ridership goes here for Joyland, White Cyclone bringing in a lot more riders this season, almost 30,000 more, mainly because I ran it with 3 trains this year as opposed to the 2 I did last year. Joyland Railroad being the most popular ride once again. All those numbers looking fairly standard. I'm really not seeing anything horribly out of the ordinary. In fact, most rides seem to be pretty close. Taxi Twirl bringing in an extra 4,000 is kind of interesting this season compared to last, but everything else looking pretty standard. So a very successful season over at Joyland for this year. And with that, we'll go ahead and head on over into the Funland finances. And something that's kind of been interesting to me as we've gone through is Funland actually started to become profitable in the month of January. We were last season too, and continued over into this year. And the big month subtractor is going to be March. We lost a little bit of money for March, mainly because of the construction for Wildcat. That's when I put it up, and that's where I took the money out for that ride. But I mean, we added an extra coaster, and we were able to bring a couple more guests in with that ride. I know we broke 8,000. I just tallied the total at the end of the month, but I know we broke 8 over the course of the year at Funland. I think it was late June, early July, we pulled in over 8,000. As far as profit goes, a little bit less than Joyland, because we have to pay so much more staff at Funland, even though we have the higher amount of guests, and that's kind of the balance we gotta strike as we start adding more to these parks, is where is the balance between staffing and total guests and total revenue coming to play. But overall, total profit at Funland was over 1.3 million and that is with, of course, subtracting out the 1 million we started with. So our total profit was 1.3 million at Funland. So less than Joyland overall, but with the longer operating season and more staff to pay, it ended up, I think, balancing out a little bit, even with the longer operating season. I mean, we would like to be making more, but just to kind of keep busy, I like to keep the park open and give us something to do over the quote-unquote off season. And as far as ridership over at Funland went, interesting thing that pops out to me right away looking at this board: Cyclone bringing in less riders. I don't know what the cause for that would be. Probably the amount of guests being drawn over to Wildcat as opposed to Cyclone, because Wildcat is on the way from the main entrance. So Cyclone drawing in a few thousand less than last season. Caravel drew in 2,000 more. If you look at our total riders for Downtown Airway, we're going to break 1 million on that thing in the 1974 season, which is crazy with how popular that ride is. But those trains carry a lot of people from the main midway over to the downtown section. Our two sky rides do phenomenal at pulling in guests too. That's over 900,000 that I'm seeing off the gate. And then the railroad is also going to be pretty popular at this park as well. Ridership looking pretty good. One thing that concerns me right off the bat with that Wildcat coaster we put in is how low the throughput for it is, with only 34,000 guests getting through it in, I mean, about 9 months of operation. Only 34,608 guests got to ride it over the course, so that's kind of a concerning stat right away. But we've committed to it. We have a Wildcat coaster, and eventually I'm hoping that just kind of builds into a less standout coaster, which at the time it kind of was, but we have Cyclone in the park already, so that's our standout at this park. And we have a kiddie coaster, and now a moderate steel thrill coaster, and then a family coaster with Caravel Mining Company. So I mean, we're looking pretty good overall for ridership, and the total riders looking very good to me overall. I mean, like I said, the only thing that really stood out to me in this list was Cyclone being so much less than the previous season. But that, I think, was due to Wildcat opening on the main midway, and we drew guests in to Wildcat as opposed to Cyclone with the advertising this year. All right, so with that, let's go ahead and draw on over into the total corporation revenue. So if you add those two numbers together, our total profit of the company was just short of $3 million, with 2.9 coming in, and we were able to bank most of that money. We keep all but 1.5 because we're going to put $1 million back into Funland and 500 back into Joyland to start next season. But in our bank, we are holding over $8.5 million for the next season. The highest attendance we had at the end of the month was the end of October at over 14,000 guests between the two parks. So as a company, we're doing pretty darn well already, and it's only 1973. As far as additions for next season go, at Funland, we're going to work on putting a new aquatic themed area in, and I'm very excited to showcase that as we get that one put together. And then we're also going to add a Wildcat coaster over to Joyland as well, so we kind of have the balancing act between those two parks, and they have very similar attractions across the board, which is what we're going to try to do at the beginning of the series. But maybe as we go further in, we kind of start splitting up a little bit. And that's really all I have on our corporation as a whole. A very successful season, and we hope to continue that on into 1974 with a couple cool additions we're going to end up having. Now let's go ahead and talk about some notable coasters that opened in 1973. The first one I want to talk about is Carolina Gold Rusher. So Carowinds actually ended up opening in 1973, and at the time, really cool park. I mean, not only at the time, but a really cool park and I've personally been there. I mean, the fact that you walk down the main street there and you can step between two states is really cool. The other thing that's kind of interesting about that park is the state tax is different between each side, so something might cost a little bit more on the north side as opposed to the South Carolina side. And Carolina Gold Rusher, one thing that stood out to me when I rode it was the benches in the trains are very, very, very tiny, and I very much struggled to fit in that ride because my butt was only like halfway on the seat when I attempted to ride it. But an Aero Mine Train, height of 43 feet, so a pretty standard Aero Mine Train coaster, but a original coaster to a pretty notable park these days at Carowinds. So 2 coasters from the same park I want to talk about now. Another park that opened in 1973 is Worlds of Fun, and this is what I would consider to be my home Cedar Fair park, or now Six Flags park, I guess. It's the first park outside of my home park I ended up going to. Worlds of Fun holds a very special place in my heart, and given I didn't get to ride these 2 rides, but I still want to go ahead and talk about them. So when Worlds of Fun opened, they opened with a Schwarzkopf extended jumbo jet called Zambezi Zinger. And you may know that name either from the original Zambezi Zinger or the new Great Coasters, Titan Track, partially wooden coaster they put up 2 years ago. The new Zambezi Zinger, which I have ridden, did not get a chance to ride the old one. Although, interesting thing about it is it still operates over in Colombia. But it stood at a height of 56 feet, rounded up to 57 feet, goes about 42 miles an hour. Really cool thing about it was this wasn't the first extended jumbo jet to open. There was one called Big Ben that opened at Six Flags Over Texas, but if you watch POVs of it, the heart lining wasn't quite there yet. It looked like a very, very rough ride, and it kind of looked like Zambezi Zinger was the more perfected version of that ride, and it would follow up with a couple coasters we'll talk about in a future episode. Their other coaster they opened, wow, that was loud. The other coaster they ended up opening with was the Shush Boomer, and the reason I wanted to talk about that is because we put up a slightly bigger version of it, but the Shush Boomer was a slightly smaller Wildcat model from Schwarzkopf. So it had a 44 feet and just about 1,500 feet of track for that ride, but kind of cool that they opened their Wildcat, and we opened a Wildcat at the same time at our park here as well. Now, the last notable coaster I want to talk about for this one, and this one would take a record from our coasters at Funland and Joyland. The Great American Scream Machine, another coaster I've had the opportunity to ride, opened at Six Flags Over Georgia in 1973, and it stood at a height of 105 feet, taking the tallest coaster from our Cyclones, which stand 100 feet. Now, Great American Scream Machine, standing 105 feet, has a top speed of 57 miles per hour and a track length of 3,450 feet, and it does overtake Cyclone and White Cyclone as the tallest coaster in the U.S. Some experience from riding Great American Scream Machine. Didn't really do much for me. Very rough ride. I think it would have run better had it still run with its original 3-bench PTCs, but now it runs the old Georgia Cyclone trains with those individual ratcheting restraints from PTC. Not a horribly big fan of those individual ratcheting restraints, although there's some coasters I do like it on, but Great American Scream Machine, unfortunately, is not one of them because it does not run horribly smooth and does not give a lot of airtime from my experience with it. But that is going to wrap up the 1973 season with the Fun Corporation. Thank you for tuning in. We've got some exciting additions coming next year in 1974. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you then.